Hey everyone, Warwick's here. Melee DPS. There's something special about being right in the mix of the fight in World of Warcraft. It just feels visceral and fast-paced. Today we're going to discuss what melee DPS specs I enjoyed the most this expansion. I played all the classes on at least the class trial, and so I can get an idea of their full kit potential when making these rankings. Like the tank and healer video, this is going to be more of a podcast style. For those that want to watch something while listening, here's a +6 Tol Dagor on my Guardian Druid. That was the warm-up for our +10 key that we did not long after this. As a reminder, this is not a ranking of power or performance this expansion. This focuses on the mechanical gameplay of every spec, and how much I enjoyed playing those mechanics. This is my personal preference, and I'd love to discuss your favorites in the comments below. Since there's 13 melee specs, I'm going to group them into 4 categories. At the bottom will be the specs that you really couldn't convince me to touch. Next is going to be the specs that had good points but didn't fully click with me. And the final group are specs that I love to play in all content when I'm not tanking. Okay, 3 categories. Let's start with the bottom group. All 3 rogue specs land here. The rogue class to me was the toughest to get into this expansion. None of the specs felt like they had in the past to me when I was a rogue main. At 13 would be subtlety. It just had a ton of damage amps to maintain, to mix in with Shadow Dance, and because of that it just felt frustrating to play. Spinning plates gameplay is not something that is my forte, but this was spinning plates for the sake of actually doing something respectable, rather than trying to maximize the damage output you do. Assassination would be at 12. To me it's a shell of itself from its Burning Crusade days, when it was definitely a burst spec that did high burst pop potential, whereas now it's much more slow and consistent, I think is a word that people would use. I like to use monotonous. And to me, the assassination rogue, when you think of assassinations, you think of something that is very quick, happens very fast, and happens pretty much very unexpectedly. Yes, you can assassinate people slowly with poisons and things like that, but that just doesn't fit the style that I think is best for this power fantasy. And at 11 is Outlaw. It's the most interesting of the 3 with its Roll the Bones RNG, but it's still just kind of a combat rogue with a fresh coat of paint on it. Okay, you added a grappling hook, a gun, and a swashbuckler theme rather than a master of weaponry. Okay, great. Rogue doesn't have much coming to it in Shadowlands that seems to change my mind about them, and if I do another one of these at the end of Shadowlands, it wouldn't shock me at all if these 3 specs end up right back in this category. Also in this group is the Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc is an incredibly powerful spec. It doesn't have a weakness. It does a ton of damage in single target and then AoE. It doesn't die because it has high leech and a strong defensive ability in Blur, and it has insane mobility. It's also very dull in my view. The only high point for me was using I-Beam, which is one of the most aesthetically pleasing abilities in WoW. But I struggled to find something that made me want to play the spec otherwise. Demon Hunter as a whole was a struggle for me. I played one a lot early on because it was fast to level to max and do allied race unlocks with. But once I got my DK or my Druid up to max level, it fell off the cliff playtime wise for me. I didn't regret not playing it. I love having Mystarius in my Mythic Plus group. He's a fantastic Demon Hunter player, but I'll let him play it instead of me. So that's the 4 in the first group. In the second group will be another group of 4. These specs were good, but had something missing. At number 9 is Survival Hunter. I talked at decent length in the Hunter retrospective about my feelings on survival. It felt incomplete. Until you got a certain level of haste, the spec feels outright bad to play. Your focus regen is poor, and the tools to regen focus are very limited, with just kill command being the big one. You were kind of forced into the Wildfire Infusion for the Red Bomb to have a good focus regen. A spec that only feels good at the end of the expansion to me is fundamentally flawed. That said, if you asked me to play it for a raid or 2 for fun, I would jump at it, as the spec at high gear does feel pretty good and has lots of potential, even if I think it should be a range spec again. At number 8, Retribution Paladin. Like Havoc, a very simple spec, but the utility of a Paladin puts this one higher on the list for me. It had varied talent setups which catered to preferred styles of play. You could pick Execution Sentence with Hammer of Wrath and Inquisition to get all the buttons, or you could pare down your buttons with talents like Zeal, Blade of Justice, and Divine Purpose for a more passive style of play. Though outside of PvP, I just struggled to have fun with the spec in longer dungeon runs. It's got some good changes in Shadowlands, but the core issues of low sustained damage and horrible mobility probably are going to make it tough to get out of this group. At number 7, Enhancement Shaman. The Builder Spender was slow at times until you fleshed it out, and you got the passives that made Enhancement Shaman fun. The spec revolving around Stormstrike and that reset mechanic made the spec feel feast or famine at times, which is both fun and frustrating. You get 5 back-to-back Stormstrike resets and you felt like a god. Go 10 seconds without one and you felt like a suburb. Overall, Enhancement was a spec that was always a blast to watch those that were passionate about the spec play. I could do it and had fun when I did the class trial, and it actually did move up a number of spots on this list after doing it. The feast famine nature for me was tough to manage or feel good about. The Shadowlands changes looked really promising. The warrior in my group, Pads, he's actually looking at potentially switching to Enhancement Shaman in Shadowlands because of the changes that he feels really, really positive about. At number 6, Frost DK. Death Knight probably takes the cake for my favorite class this expansion. Frost just misses the top 5 because of one major issue, Breath of Syndragosa. This one talent dominated the spec and made it untenable to play any other playstyle. For me, I loved the Ice Cap and the Obliteration builds, but they were not viable at all this expansion. Breath did a really good job of making smart decision making about pooling resources, which is something that Frost never really had before kind of Legion, but mainly Battle for Azeroth. Sadly, I just didn't enjoy the playstyle. It doesn't seem like Frost is moving away from the Breath build. In fact, with Hypothermic Presence as a talent mix expansion, it looks like the spec is doubling down on that build. Even with that said, I still found Frost to be a very distinct difference in playstyle from Unholy or Blood. Even as simple as it was, I still found myself having fun with the spec, trying to hit the right Frostforce Fury or maximizing my Gathering Storm to do peak AoE damage. 2-handed Frost in Shadowlands definitely piques my interest, but I want to see it kind of be supported through the Ice Cap, the Obliteration builds, so that if you choose to dual wield, you're kind of picking Breath. If you choose to go 2-handed, you can really maximize your weapon damage through Ice Cap or Obliteration. If either of those builds get support, I could see myself potentially committing to it as a primary DPS spec in Shadowlands. That now brings us to the top 5. These are the specs that I loved playing in all content that I could get them into. These are the melee specs you will most likely find me trying in Shadowlands, either as off specs of my main tank characters, or in the case of like the warrior specs, these are going to be just kind of chill characters that maybe I muck around with as a 4th character. We'll start at number 5 with Windwalker Monk. Windwalker has a very interesting playstyle that encourages different ability usage each time you press a button. Its playstyle promotes something different from just smash your one button over and over again type playstyle that other characters and specs have. Windwalker has its problems for sure. It doesn't scale well. Things like Xuen only scale with one particular stat that isn't actually all that good for Windwalker, and things like Fist of the White Tiger should be baseline and aren't at this time. But I found the spec surprisingly more fun than I gave it credit for originally. Enhancement Shaman moved up 4 spots. Windwalker was going to be sitting around number 8 before I actually got in and really got my teeth into it in the class trial. There's a litany of potential that I think is just sitting under the surface. Invoke Xuen I found to be flavorful with the lore of monks, and Fist of the White Tiger was so instrumental in helping chi generation. That's why I think that talent should be baseline next expansion. Its AoE use was interesting with Fist of Fury, and also weaving Tiger Palms or Blackout kicks to set up massive spinning crane kicks. I feel like there's a lot of things under the hood that should be fixed with Windwalker, and it would become sort of a quiet powerhouse style spec. Lots of scaling stuff can be fixed. Make Xuen scale with Mastery or with Crit or something. Just something that makes Windwalker have a stat priority other than just eye level. I think that'd be really good for Windwalker. It gives them a lot more focus in terms of what they should be looking at moving into Shadowlands. That said, like I said, I was really surprised by just how much I enjoyed the spec, and so I'm really looking forward to trying it out, as Monk will be one of my 4 characters in Shadowlands, potentially my main ult. At number 4, Arms Warrior. The big thing I loved about ARMS is that its cooldowns lined up very well with each other, which made the high points of the spec happen often and feel really satisfying every single time. The theme of ARMS is that your weapon is like a sledgehammer. It's slow but impactful every time it hits. I think it did a pretty good job of reaching that fantasy this expansion. Every button felt like it had a purpose, which I think is somewhat rare from many specs in Warcraft. You have a lot of filler abilities that don't feel like they serve a purpose other than to fill globals. Think Steady Shot for Marksmanship Hunter, Frostbolt acting as a filler for Frost Mages, just these buttons that you just kind of hit to hit, but not because they serve any sort of specific purpose. Bladestorm, Warbreaker, and Mortal Strike just felt like powerful buttons to use when they were active. The reason that it just misses the top 3 for me was that it was squishy. It didn't have any good self-sustain, kind of had Victory Rush, or if you talented the one where you get the on-demand 30-second cooldown, 20% heal. I don't remember the name of the ability off the top of my head. I apologize, Warriors. And it didn't really have a good defensive ability. It had the one where you get all the parry, but that doesn't really do you any good unless you're actually taking damage. You had nothing that was good against environmental damage, or AoE, or magic damage. Just nothing there was useful for Warriors. The other thing with ARMS is that it could take some gear to start to feel really good, or you start getting the proper corruptions that allows you to make the spec feel as fast. The slower playstyle early on, I think, is what turned a lot of people off because its actions per minute was very low compared to, say, Fury, where you're basically wearing out your keyboard every single time. But once you got corruptions, ARMS became with as many APM, if not more, than Fury. I'd have to double check the numbers on it. So something that can maybe continue that into Shadowlands might be a good idea for ARMS to kind of keep its viability moving long term. At number 3, Feral Druid. This might surprise you if you've seen my Druid retrospective, where I do say that I like Feral in theory. In practice, though, I actually did enjoy it when I didn't care about performance. It has some major issues that need to be addressed. But like I said, if you didn't care about performance, I think you could find a lot of fun with this spec. For me, that was mainly like time walking dungeons when we were trying to help gear up pads as Paladin or something like that. I'd go in with my Druid just to play Feral and have some fun with it. The power fantasy is also very real to me. I love the idea of a shapeshifted druid using the power of animalistic instinct to defeat your enemies. The dungeon build that was used early on in the expansion by talenting Predator in the 15 row and Moment of Clarity in the 100 row, I had a blast with it, though eventually Blood Talents just became too good. Some of the changes moving forward are interesting in theory. The Blood Talents change, I think, makes it a little bit more user-friendly, and the Sabretooth nerf was desperately needed, and Lunar Inspiration apparently has got a very significant buff to it that may make it another ability that you want to use. I'm not sure that adding an ability that costs energy and only grants 1 combo point is something that's going to help Feral, though. I'd like to see something else happen, like Feral Frenzy becoming baseline. Is something that would be really, really useful for Feral to feel a lot better and for people to maybe take it somewhat seriously. There's still some basic level items that need to be addressed. Like I said, baselining Feral Frenzy would be a huge one. Its defensive toolkit has seen some ups and downs in it, and it needs something in a utility kit that makes it feel like you would want to actually have a Feral Druid in your party. Feral and Guardian suffer from the same things, where that their utility kit is kind of brought by Resto or Balanced Druids. Now the Stampeding Roar is a baseline ability, and so I would like to see them get something that kind of makes them unique and makes people go, hey, would a Feral Druid work for here? Would a Guardian Druid work for here? But I'll stop complaining about the things that I'd like to see with Feral and just focus on the big aspects where I quite enjoy the bleed style. I actually think the spinning plate style here is actually good versus a spinning plate style with, say, like Sub-Rogue. And so I really like the way that this spec feels moving forward and on some level of baseline. But I do think there needs to be more iteration done to the spec, or some massive utility needs to be brought that is going to help make it feel like groups, whether it's Mythic Plus or raids, are going to want one in the raid, other than just, hey, that guy's a fun player to be around. Yeah, he wants to play it, let him play it. What's the harm? Alright, moving on. At number 2, Fury Warrior. Fury is fast-paced, integrates AoE damage very well, and has a couple of variations in build depending on the 100 row talent you choose. It kind of impacts your essence setup, which I think is kind of neat. Overall, the spec had no ramp-up time and felt like it's power fantasy. Fury is known for hitting, hard and occasionally sometimes fast. You're furious in your strikes. And you did the same to your keyboard when you played Fury. The buttons were very short cooldowns, so you were smashing them all the time. You were never taking a break, essentially, unless there was a break in the fight. You didn't actually go through and rest on your laurels as a Fury Warrior. It's just satisfying to play. Like, I'm struggling to explain why I liked Fury Warrior, I think, right here. But it just know that, like, with my warrior, once I hit 120 on him and got started on, like, getting some 385 gear after you hit the initial leveling stuff and you start getting, like, even the most basic of upgrades, it just started to feel much more right. The other thing I like in terms of my DPS builds is crit stacking. That's why Feral is probably pretty high on this list. And Hot Steel Cold Blood Azurite trait made crit stacking a thing for Fury, which just makes my heart giggle, because I love just seeing the numbers pop. Warrior actually has a possibility of being my 4th character in Shadowlands if Marksmanship Hunter and Survival Hunter don't get more changes. Those are 2 specs that I want to be able to play. Like I said, as much as I bag on Survival for this expansion, I still think there's a lot of things that could be done with it that make it pretty good. And Marksman, while it is quite a good spec, I think now in terms of some of its baselines, there's just a lot of stuff going on in Shadowlands with it that I think is being hidden because it's doing a crap ton of damage at this time. But we're going to move on to number 1, and that is the Unholy DK. If you've watched any of my videos, I don't think this surprises you. I even said in my DK retrospective video that Unholy was my favorite DPS spec overall this expansion. It has a highly engaging gameplay loop combined with a fantastic power fantasy, and that's what put it over the top for me. While the single target build didn't do a lot numbers-wise versus, say, an AoE build, both styles were still really fun to play and brought on a good challenge of trying to pay attention to the specifics of what you were doing with your button presses and, like, maintaining your festering wounds or maximizing the number of wounds you pop versus what's actually going on in the fight as well. Having an army of ghouls at your disposal felt very powerful. Using Apocalypse, Army of the Dead, having even one Magus of the Dead Azurite trait looked and felt cool to do. Getting Gargoyle back in Shadowlands only amps my excitement for this spec. This spec, like Blood did for tanks, just ticked all the boxes that I had and what I was looking for. It has a very cool power fantasy, their abilities that felt really impactful, and they have a cool lore behind the class as well, which, yeah, that's kind of important. Even though most classes in Warcraft have virtually no lore behind them, Death Knights, Paladins, Priests, these are specs and classes that do have really cool lore behind them, so that always bumps them up just a little bit on my list. So that wraps up my thoughts on melee DPS. If we did a power ranking of how classes performed, 4 out of the top 5 for me probably wouldn't even crack the top half of this list. The only one that might, depending on what patch you're looking at, will be Arms Warrior for the later parts of the expansion, and maybe Fury for, like, the middle parts of the expansion. But specs like Assassination Rogue, Havoc Demon Hunter, as you've seen in my DH retrospective, are just super, super powerful. But spec like Windwalker has been the least played spec, the least played class this entire expansion, which I think is a shame, because I do think the spec is fun. It just suffers from performance issues that make it so that people don't want to play them. I like that my specs, though, that I chose in my top 5 are mostly undervalued, particularly in a raid setting. It felt like playing them and being successful with them felt much better. Anyways, what were your top 5 melee specs this expansion? Leave a comment below, and remember to like, share, and subscribe to the video. Ranged DPS is coming soon, and that group is a lot tougher to rank, though not for the reasons that you may think. Since we're at the end of the video and this dungeon run's almost done, I'm just going to leave you with music to see the end of the run, see the Korgus fight at the end. So we'll just leave you with that one today. So until next time, everyone, stay safe, wear your mask, and I will see you next time.